Welcome to another session of INF154. So in this session, we are going to focus on nested loops. So a nested loop is a loop inside another loop. So it can be a for loop inside a while loop, or it can be a while loop inside a for loop, or it can be a while loop within a while loop. So let's recap how a normal loop works. So with a normal counter control loop, we know that you have to initialize your counter, then you must have your condition, which is your Boolean expression, then you must have a task, then you must have an update. Then let's consider the flow diagram of the above loop. How does it work? So you always start at the initialization. So here we are going to start at k equals to 0. Then we are going to check, is k less than 5? If that condition is true, we are going to add k to the list box. So in this case, k is 0, 0 is less than 5, so we are going to add 5 to the list box. Then we are going to increment k. So we are going to increase k by 1. After incrementing k, we are going to go back to the condition. We have to check the newly updated k. In this case, the newly updated k is 1. So we have to check, is 1 less than 5? Yes, 1 is less than 5. Hence, we are going to add that 1 to the list box. Then we have to update k, which is 2 now. Then we have to go back to the condition and retest the condition until the specific condition is false. Once the condition is false, you exit the loop. So you are going to execute the following code. So message box.show done. So let's see how this code is executed. So as I mentioned, initially k is 0. This is the initialization. So we are going to check, is 0 less than 5? Yes, this condition is true. What are we going to do? We are going to execute the code inside the loop. So the code inside the loop says add that specific k to a list box. In this case, we are going to add 0 to the list box. Then after adding that k to the list box, we are going to increment k. So k will increase by 1. So now our newly updated k is 1. So we have, after increasing k, where do we go? We go back to the condition. So we have to loop through the condition. So we have to recheck, is 1 less than 5? 1 is less than 5. Hence, we are going to execute the code inside. The code inside says add k to the list box. In this case, our k is 1, so 1 will be added to the list box. Then after that, our k will be incremented to 2. So we are going to check again, is 2 less than 5? Yes, 2 is less than 5. Hence, we are going to add k, which is 2, to the list box. Then we are going to move to k to 3. So we have to check, is 3 less than 5? Yes, 3 is less than 5. We are going to add that 3 to the list box. Then after, we have to increment k. So k will go to 4. We have to check, is 4 less than 5? Yes, 4 is less than 5. Hence, we have to add k, which is 4, to the list box. Then after that, we have to increase k. So now k is 5. Then we check the condition. Is 5 less than 5? No, 5 is not less than 5. Hence, we have to exit the loop, or we have to stop the loop. In this case, 5 is not less than 5. When we exit this loop, we get this message box.show. So it's going to display done on our list box. So that was a recap of single loops. We did this many times. I think there are 3 videos regarding this single loops or normal loops. So the idea is that you have to initialize based on the condition. If the condition is true, you repeat the code inside until the condition becomes false. Then when it's false, you exit the loop. So when you are done executing the loop, we say you are going to exit the loop. So now we can converting between a while loop and a for loop. This is another important point that you have to know. So we know that with a while loop, you have to initialize your counter outside the loop. Then you have this while, then you have to check the condition. So if the condition is true, you are going to perform a task, then update. But when we convert this to a for loop combines almost everything on one line of code. So you have this for keyword, then your initialize counter go inside the loop. So it goes inside the loop. Then then you put a semicolon, then it's followed by the condition, then semicolon, then you have the update, then the task goes inside the loop, so within the body of the loop. So you have to be able to know how to convert between a for loop and a while loop. So here I guess there are a few notes. So executing the for loop is the same as executing the while loop. So by now you should know that you must initialize counter only once. So you don't initialize many times. So you only execute this code only once. Then after initializing the counter, you check the condition. You check if the condition is true. Then the direction is that you start from initialize counter, then you check if the condition is true. If the condition is true, where do you go? You go to the task. Then after doing the task, you go to the update. Then after updating, you retest the condition. So that's the idea. We did that. Then otherwise, if the condition is false, you exit the loop or you stop the loop. So as an example, we have to consider the following program. So in this case, they say given n, write a code that will print n stars on a rich text box. So for example, if n equals to 1, it prints 1 star. If n equals to 2, it prints 2 stars, and so on. So how do we solve this specific problem? So the solution is to identify the counter and its bounds. So in this case, for example, when we choose n equals to 3, we see that there are 3 stars. So we are going to start counting from 1. You can start at 0, but in this case, I'm just going to choose counting from 1 because it makes sense. If I have 1, I'm going to print 1 star, 2 stars, 3 stars. You can start at 0. So when we identify our counter, we notice that our counter, it's I. It will always start at 1 and it will end at n. Because look at this. Here you have 1, then it ends at n. Here you have 1, 2. This 2 is n. Here you have 1, 2, 3. This 3 is n. So in general, we notice that I is always greater or equals to 1 and less than or equals to n. So if you start counting at 0. So if you start counting at 1. So if you start counting at 0, you are going to have 0 here, then less or equals to I. But here you are going to have less than n, not less equals to. Because you are going to have 0, then 1, 2. Then after identifying that, so we just count from 1 to n. So every iteration, we are going to count from 1 to n. So every time we count, we are going to add a star to the rich text box. It's as easy as that. So we are going to start our I at 1, then we are going to end at n, less or equals to then I plus plus. This means count from 1 until you reach n, then you increment I. So every time you are counting, you are going to add a star to the rich text box. So that's the idea. So as an exercise, you are going to verify your code by executing it on paper, the way I did on the previous one. Do it yourself. So for n equals to 6, you have to show all the steps. So it's very easy to execute this code. So I won't go into detail because you are let's say for n equals to 3. So you are going to start at 1. You check, is 1 less or equals to n, which is 3. Yes, 1 is less or equals to 3. You are going to print the star. Plus equals to means add to the previous output. Then you are going to move your I to 2. So now I will be 2. Then you have to check, is 2 less or equals to 3? Yes, 2 is less or equals to 3. We are going to add a second star. Then I will be 3. Is 3 less or equals to 3? Yes, 3 less or equals to 3. So I'm going to add a star. Then I equals to 4. It's 4 less or equals to 4. No. So I have to exit the loop. At the end, I have 3 stars. So this is an easy code to execute. Then another example. So given n, write a code that will print a pattern. So for example, when n equals to 2, we have this pattern of 4 stars. When n equals to 4, we still have like every column has 2 stars, but now this was a typo. This must be n equals to 3. So now we have 3 stars. 3 lines. In this case, n equals to 2, we have 2 lines. N equals to 3, we have 3 lines. N equals to 1, we have 1 line. So the solution, you have to identify your counter and understand the problem. So you have to understand the pattern. So we noticed that n affects the number of lines. Then we notice that the number of stars is always fixed. So you are just adding 2 stars, then you are adding a new line because you are moving to the next line. Then you are adding 2 stars, then you are adding what? A new line. Then you are adding 2 stars, then you are adding a what? A new line. So we are going to identify our counter as the number of lines. So you repeat the same process how many times? N times. Because n was 2, here we repeated the process 2 times. N was 3, we repeated the process 3 times. N was 1, we repeated the process once. So I have to identify my counter. So my counter will start at 1 and it will end at n. So it ends at n. So in this case, it's 1 less equals to I less or equals to n. If you started at 0 again, you are going to have less than n. So here we started at 1. So you have to be careful. So here we are just adding 2 stars and a new line every time we are counting. So it's not that difficult also. So the code for counting, we know how to do that for counting from 1 up to n. So we start at 1 less or equals to n I plus plus. But how do we add 2 stars and a new line? We just say RTB out dot text. You see, I forgot dot text. So you have to be careful. You must put your dot text. Plus equals to, then we add 2 stars and a new line. So that's the idea. So again, manually execute the code on paper for n equals to 5. Show all the steps. So for example, if n equals to, let's say 2, we are going to start at 1. So is 1 less than or equals to 2? Yes, 1 is less or equals to 2. What are we going to do? We are going to execute the code inside. The code inside says add 2 stars to your rich text box and move to the next line. So we are going to move to the next line. Then after that, where do we go? We are going to increment our I. So now our I will be 2. Then we check, is 2 less or equals to 2? Yes, 2 is less or equals to 2. What are we going to do? Add 2 stars to the rich text box. So I'm going to add 2 stars to the rich text box. Then I'm going to move to the new line. Then now my I is 3. Then I check, is 3 less or equals to 2? No, that's not true. So I'm going to stop the loop. At the end, I have this number of stars. So this was not difficult. So it seems as if we can solve everything with the single loops. So why do we bother about nested loops? So we are going to see why do we bother about nested loops. For now, let's consider nested loops. So a nested loop is a loop inside a loop. So what's the general flow diagram? So the flow diagram is like this. So you start with initialization. So let's say initialize 1. This is your first initialization. Then based on the condition, on condition 1, you check if the condition is true. We know that we are going to execute like a block of statements. So if the condition is true, we are going to execute a block of statements. Then we are going to retest the condition. Otherwise, we are going to exit the loop. But inside those block of statements, we have another loop. So we are going to execute initialize to for the inner loop. Then we are going to check the condition for the inner loop. So if the condition for the inner loop is true, we are going to perform some task. Then we are going to update the counter for the inner loop. Then we go back to the condition. Then if it's false, we exit the inner loop. Then we update the counter for the outer loop. Then we repeat the process. But it's going to make sense. I know now it doesn't make sense, but it's going to make sense soon. So let's consider the syntax. So with the while loop, you have initialization outside the loop for the outer loop. So this initialization is for the outer loop. Then we have this while condition while. So this is your outer loop. Then inside the loop, you have this initialization, which is the initialization for the inner loop. So we have this while, which is your inner loop. So for the inner loop, we have to do a task. Then we have to update for that specific inner loop. So we are going to repeat the inner loop until its condition becomes false before we can go to update the outer loop. Then after that, that's where we can go to the condition. But it will make sense soon. It will make sense. Then you can even have nested for loops. So you have for initialization 1, then condition 1, update 1. With the for loop is not that confusing because everything that belongs to the outer loop, it's here. Then everything that belongs to the inner loop is here. Then you have the task. So this is your outer loop. This is your inner loop. So with the for loop is not that confusing compared to the while loop, but it's all the same. So let's consider an example now. So let's say we have the following code. I can even write it on Sublime just to. So you have your int n equals to 4, then int I equals to 1. Let me just zoom. Then you have int sum equals to 0. Then you have while I is less than n. Then you just have this int k equals to n. Then you have the while loop again. So while k is greater than 0, then sum plus equals to I plus j, like that, or I plus k. So then we have k minus minus. Then we have I plus plus. So how will we execute this specific loop? So this is the execution. So I'm going to start here, initialization outside the loop. So outside I have n, which is 4, then I have I, which is 1, then I have sum, which is 0. Then I'm going to execute this. I'm going to test this condition. It's I less than n. So our I is 1. So we have to check is 1 less than n, which is 4. Yes, the condition is true. So we have to execute the code inside the loop. So inside the loop, what do we get? Inside the loop, we get this, k equals to n. What is n? N is 4. Then we have to check. After that, we execute this loop. So we have to check, is k greater than 0? So in this case, is 4 greater than 0? Yes, 4 is greater than 0. So we execute the code inside the inner loop. The code inside the inner loop says sum equals to, so sum equals to the previous sum. The previous sum was 0 plus I, which is 1, plus k, which is 4. So the result will be 5. So this sum will be 5. Then we are done with this part. Then we are going to decrement k. So we are going to decrease k by 1. So k equals to 3. Then after decreasing k, where do we go? We are going to go back to the condition of the inner loop. So we execute the inner loop until we are done before we can go to the next line. So we are going to execute the inner loop until we finish executing it. So in this case, we are going to check is k, which is 3, greater than 0. Yes, that's true. What are we going to do? Execute the code inside the loop. So the code inside the loop says sum is equals to the previous sum, which is 5, plus I, which is still 1, plus k, which is now 3. So if we add these together, we are going to get 9. Then that, after this line of code, we are going to update k. So we are going to decrease k. So now k will be 2. Then after that, where do we go? We are going to go back to the condition. So we have to check, is 2 greater than 0? Yes, 2 is greater than 0. What are we going to do? We are going to execute this line of code. So this line of code says, to the previous sum, we are going to add I, which is still 1, plus k, which is now 1. So now the result will be what? Will be 11. So after that, where do we go? We are going to decrement k. So now k will be what? K is equals to 1. Then we have to check, is 1 greater than 0? After decrementing, we go, is 1 greater than 0? Yes. The sum equals to what? The previous sum, which is 11, plus I, which is 1, plus k, which is 1. And I made a mistake on the previous one. This was supposed to be 2. The value of k is 2. So this was supposed to be 12. Now this is supposed to be 12 plus 1 plus 1. So now we have 14, like that. Then after this sum, we are going to go to k. We are going to decrease k by 1. So now k will be 0. Then after decreasing k, where do we go? We have to check, is 0 greater than 0? No. So we have to exit what? We have to exit the inner loop. So exit the inner loop. So after exiting this inner loop, we get this I plus plus. So I will be incremented to 2. So now this will be I equals to 2. Then after incrementing I, where do we go? We go back to the condition of the outer loop. Then we check, is 2 less than n, which is 4? Yes, that's the case. So what are we going to do? We execute the code inside the loop. So inside the loop, we get this line of code k equals to n. So we get this k equals to n, which is 4. Then what are we going to do? We are going to get the inner loop. Again, we are going to repeat the same process inside the inner loop until the condition becomes false. That's where we can update I. So I'm going to say, okay, the inner loop is going to check, is 4 greater than 0? Yes, 4 is greater than 0. What are we going to do if 4 is greater than 0? Sum equals to the previous sum. So sum equals to the previous sum, which is 14, plus I plus k. So I now it's 2 plus k, which is currently 4. So when I add these together, I get what? I get 20. Then after that, where do I go? Next line says decrease k by 1. So now k will be what? Will be 4. Will be 3. Then we have to check, is 3 greater than 0? Yes, 3 is greater than 0. Then sum equals to, then you can just repeat the process until you finish executing the whole loop. So I'll leave that as an exercise. So now let's see what's next. Then another example is this one. Now we have nested for loops. So it's a for loop inside a for loop. So you guys must finish this one. So as an exercise. Then if you have any questions, you can ask. Then we have this int n equals to 5. Then we have int m equals to, I think it's 100,000. Then we have this int result, which is 0. Then we have a for loop. So we have a for loop int I equals to 1. Then we have this I less than n. Then I plus plus. Then we have a loop. So for int k equals to m, k is greater than 0, k divide equals to 10. Then we have if I modulus 2 is equals to 0, what are we going to do? We are going to say result plus equals to I. Then otherwise, else result plus equals to n. So let's see how this works. So again, I'm going to execute the code step by step. So we are going to start at initialization. So initially, what do you have? So initially, you have n, which is 5, m, which is 100,000. So let me remove the comments so that you can see the values. Then we have result, which is 0. Basically, we want the value of result after executing this whole loop. So again, we are going to execute the loop. So we start at initialization. So I equals to 1. So we have to check, is 1 less than n? It's 1 less than 5. Yes, 1 is less than 5. What are we going to do? We are going to execute the code inside the loop. Inside the loop, we get another loop. With the other loop, we are going to start at initialization. So initialization says k is equals to m. So m is 100,000. So we have to check now, is 100,000 greater than 0? Yes, this is true. What are we going to do? We execute the code inside. The code inside is an if statement. So we are going to check the if statement. I modulus 2, 1 modulus 2 equals to 0. No, this is not true. So what are we going to do? We are going to execute the else part. So the else part says result is equals to the previous result. So the previous result was 0 plus n. So our n is what? It's 5. So this is going to be 5. Then we are done with this code. Then where do we go? We go to the update of the inner loop. Always we execute the inner loop until we are done. So inner loop says k divide equals to 10. So you're going to divide 100,000 by 10, which is 10,000. So we are going to check, after dividing, after updating, we are going to check, is 10,000 greater than 0? So we have to check if 10,000 is greater than 0. Yes, 10,000 is greater than 0. So what are we going to do? We are going to execute the code inside. Then we have to check, it's I modulus 2. I is still 1. It's 1 modulus 2 equals to 0. No. So result equals to the previous result plus n. So the previous result is 5 plus n, which is 5. So now we get 10. Then we are going to update k. So k divide equals to 10. So k will be what? Will be 1,000, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 10,000 divided by 10. Then we have to check, is 1,000 greater than 0? Yes, 1,000 is greater than 0. Then we have to check 1 modulus 2 equals to 0. No, this is not the case. So result equals to 10 plus 5, which is equals to 15, because we are executing the else part. Then I'm going to repeat this. Now k will be what? Will be 100. Then you have to check, is 100 greater than 0? Yes, 100 is greater than 0. If that's the case, execute the code inside. The code inside says 1 modulus 2. Is it equals to 0? No. Result equals to the previous result, which is 15 plus 5. So which is equals to 20. So here I made a mistake. It was supposed to be equals to. Then after that, what are we going to do? Now our k will be what? Will be 10, because 100 divided by that. So we check, is 10 greater than 0? Yes, we have to check again. 1 modulus 2 equals to 0. No. The result will be what? It's going to be the previous, which is plus 5, which is equals to 25. Then again, we are going to divide 10 by 10. 10 divided by 10 is what? It's 1. So k will be 1. So it's 1 greater than 0. Yes, 1 is greater than 0. So we are going to execute the same code. Check I modulus 2 equals to 0. No, so result equals to previous result plus 5. So now k is equals to what? Is equals to 0, because 1 divided by 10, k equals to k over 10. So 1 divided by 10 is 0. It's 0.01, but these are integers, so we ignore the decimal. So we check, is 0 greater than 0? No. So we are going to exit the inner loop. So exit the inner loop. So after exiting the inner loop, this means we are going to update our outer loop. So we are going to update I. So now I will be what? I will be increased by 2. Then we have to check, is 2 less than 5? Yes, 2 is less than 5. Then we execute the inner loop. So for the inner loop, where are we going to start? We are going to start at k equals to m. So k is going to start where? Again, k will start at 100,000 again. Then we have to check, is 100,000 greater than 0? Yes, 100,000 is greater than 0. What are we going to do? Execute the code inside. The code inside says I modulus 2 equals to 0. In this case, our I modulus 2, 2, it's 2 modulus 2, because our I is 2. Is it equals to 0? Yes, that's the case. What are we going to do if that's the case? Result plus equals to I. So result is equals to the previous result. So the latest result was this 30 actually. So I forgot to say 30 plus I. So 30 plus I, which is 2. So now we have 32. So you will execute the rest of the loop. As an exercise, you'll do the rest of the loop. But for me, I'm going to stop here because you have to practice. So I'm going to close that. So we saw how to execute like nested loop. You make sure that you execute the inner loop until you are done before you can update the outer loop. So that's the general idea. Then now we want a more interesting problem. So given n and m, write a code that will print a rectangle. For example, given n equals to 2, m equals to 3, we have this rectangle. Then given n equals to 4, then m equals to 2, we have this rectangle. What do we notice about this? We notice that n, which is 2, represents the lines. Then m, which is 3, represents the columns. Even here, n represents the number of lines. Then m represents the number of stars, or the number of columns. So we have to try to identify a pattern. So in this case, m will be 4, then n will be 3. For example, you can choose anything. So if you choose these two, you have this pattern. N is 3, so the number of lines will be 3. M is 4, so the number of lines will be 4. So, I mean the number of stars or the number of columns. So in the y direction or in this direction, we have I, which will count from 1, 2, up to what? Up to n. Then in this other direction, we have k, which will count from 1, 2, 3, 4, up to m. So in general, our I starts at 1 and it's going to end at n. Then our k starts at 1 and ends at m. So the inner loop is responsible for the stars or for the columns. So remember that first loop that we considered, it was this one. It was this loop. So the inner loop is exactly like this. But in our case, it's going to depend on k. So you have the same loop as, let me erase here. So the loop that is responsible for stars is the same as this. So this will be your inner loop. So now if I go back to our main thing, so I'm going to scroll down. So the outer loop is responsible for the rows and a new line, because every time you have a row and a new line, row and a new line, row and a new line. So you are going to print M stars first. Then after printing M stars, you are going to print a new line. So this is a loop on its own. Then you are going to repeat the same process how many times? N times. So in this case, if we convert that, if we put everything together, we are going to get an inner loop which is responsible for printing the stars. So it's going to start at 1 and it's going to end at M. Then we have to increment K. So it's responsible for printing the stars. Then after printing the stars, we are now going to print a new line. Then, so after printing the stars, we are going to print a new line. Then we repeat the whole process n times. So let's see how this works. So let me just do this. So I have this nested loop. So let's say example, then n equals to 3, then m equals to 2, for example. So I have this code for int I equals to 1, I must be less or equals to n, then I plus plus, then I have the inner loop, which is for int k equals to 1, k must be less or equals to m, then k plus plus. So this is what I have. Then the inner loop is responsible for the stars. So the inner loop is responsible for the stars. Then the outer loop is responsible for repeating that same process. So plus equals to a new line. So how are we going to execute this? Initially, we have n, which is 3. Then we have m, which is 2. Then we are going to start with the loop. So with the loop, we are going to start at 1. I will start at 1. So we have I equals to 1. Then we check the condition. It's 1 less or equals to n. It's 1 less or equals to 3. Yes, 1 is less or equals to 3. What are we going to do? We are going to execute the code inside. The code inside, we get another loop. For the loop, we always start where? At the initialization. So k will start at 1. So again, we are going to check is 1 less than or equals to m, which is 2. Yes, what are we going to do? We are going to execute this code inside. We are going to add a star in our rich text box. So let me say this is my rich text box. So I'm going to add a star. one star. Then after this line of code, where am I going to go? I'm going to update my k. I will don't exit this loop until I'm done. So I'm going to update k. K will be increased by 1. So k equals to 2. Then we have to check, is 2 less or equals to m? Is 2 less or equals to m? In this case, our m is 2. Yes. What are we going to do? We are going to execute the code inside the inner loop. Again, we are going to add a star wherever we ended. Then after that, where are we going to go? We are going to update our k. Now our k will be 3. So k equals to 3. Then we have to check the condition again. Is 3 less or equals to 2? No. So we exit the inner loop. Then after exiting the inner loop, we go to this line. This line says add a new line to the rich text box. So this means we have to move to the next line. So we are here now, somewhere here. Just then after that, after executing this inner code, where am I going to go? I'm going to increment I. So I will be incremented to what? To 2. So I equals to 2. Then we check, is 2 less or equals to n? So is 2 less or equals to 3? Yes, 2 is less or equals to 3. What are we going to do? Execute the code inside the loop. Inside the loop, I'm going to start at the initialization. So I'm going to start where at k equals to 1. So k equals to 1. Then after that, I'm going to check the condition. Is k less or equals to m? It's 1 less or equals to, so k is equals to 1. It's 1 less or equals to m, which is 2. Yes. What am I going to do? I'm going to add a star wherever we ended. So we remember we ended on a new line. So I'm going to add a star here. Then after that, what's going to happen? I'm going to increase my k by 1. So now my k will go to what? To 2. Then I have to check, is 2 less or equals to 2? Yes, 2 is less or equals to 2. Again, we are going to add a star wherever we ended. So we ended here. So we are going to append a star. Then after that, where do we go? We increase k again. So now k is 3. So k is equals to 3. We check, is 3 less or equals to 3? I mean, 3 less or equals to 2. No. So we stop the inner loop, or we exit the inner loop. Then exiting the inner loop leads us to this code, which says add a new line. So we are going to continue on the next line. Then after that, after this last line of code, I'm going to increase the I by 1. So I now will be increased to what? I will be 3. Then we have to check, is 3 less or equals to 3? Yes, 3 is less or equals to 3. Execute the code inside. The code inside, we get a loop. So for the loop, we are going to start k equals to 1. We start at initialization. We check the condition. Then we check, is 1 less or equals to 2? Yes, 1 is less or equals to 2. What are we going to do? Add a star. So we are going to add a star wherever we ended. It was this line. So we are going to add a star. Then after adding a star, where do you go? We increase k by 1. So k now is what? K will become 2. Then we have to check, is 2 less or equals to 2? Yes. 2 is less or equals to 2. We add a star again. So we are going to add another star. So add a star. Then after that, we increase k. So now k will be 3. So we check, is 3 less or equals to 2? No. So we stop the inner loop. So the inner loop. So we exit the inner loop. When we exit the inner loop, we get this sort of like move to the new line. So we are going to continue to a new line, sort of. Then after that, what are we going to do? We are going to increase I. So I will be what? I will be 4. Then we check, is 4 less or equals to 3? No. So we exit the what? The outer loop. So that's the idea. So that's how you execute that specific loop. At the end, you're going to get this pattern. Like that, as easy as that. So now we are going to an alternative of plus equals to rtb out dot text plus equals, you can say rtb out dot append text, then you put whatever code you want to append. It's the same as plus equals to. Then now we are moving to another problem. So the other problem says given n, print a right angled triangle. So in this case, for n equals to 1, we have this one star. For n equals to 2, we have this triangle. For n equals to 4, we have this triangle. So again, the solution, we have to try to identify a pattern. In this case, n equals to 4. For n equals to 4, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Then again, it's like that. So we know that our outer loop is responsible for the number of lines. So that doesn't change. It's just I less or equals to n. I mean, 1 less or equals to I, and then less or equals to n. So we are going to check, we are going to try and identify the pattern. So for n equals to 1, how many stars do we print? We are printing 1 stars. Then for n equals to 2, how many stars are we printing? For I equals to 1, sorry, not n. For I equals to 1, we are printing 1 star. For I equals to 2, we are printing 2 stars. For I equals to 3, we are printing 3 stars. Then for I equals to 4, we are printing 4 stars. So notice that our k always starts at 1, but it's going to repeat depending on I. So in this case, I is 1. K started at 1 and ended at 1. Here, K started at 1 but ended at 2, which is your I. Here, K started at 1 but ended at 3, which is your I. Here, K started at 1 but ended at 4, which is your I. So in this case, we notice that K will always start at 1, but it will end at I. So that was the difficult part. Other than that, the inner loop is going to start from 1 up to I, and it's going to be responsible for the stars as usual. But the outer loop will start from 1 up to n, and it's responsible for the number of rows or the number of lines. So when we combine everything together, the inner loop, which is responsible for the stars, we have this. So k equals to 1, k must be less or equals to I, then k plus plus. You are printing I stars, then you are going to a new line. Then you repeat the whole process how many times? N times. So yeah, that's the idea. As an exercise, you can execute this loop on your own. So you can execute this for n equals to 6. So this is an exercise. You have to execute this loop for n equals to 6. You have to show all the solutions on paper. So it's easier to execute on paper than on like the computer. So another example, given n and m, we want to write a code to print a hollow rectangle of length n and width m. So again, for n equals to 3, we have this height, which is your length, which is 3, and we have this width, which is your 4, which is your m in general. So in this case, it's 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Then 1, 2, 3. For 4, 3, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Then 1, 2, 3. So how do we solve this? Again, you have to try to identify the pattern. In this case, for n equals to 4, m equals to 4, we notice that we have these stars, but these stars are separated by what? By these tabs. These are tabs. So in your Visual Studio, they won't be visible. So this is a tab again. This is a tab. Then again, star tab, then star tab. Then we can extend this to the end like this so that we can see a pattern at the end. So we notice that when we are at the edges, so we know an edge. So edge is sort of like when you are drawing, this is an edge, this is an edge, this is an edge, this is an edge. These are edges, something that you put, this is an edge. So at the edges, so we have, what do we notice at the edges? At the edges, we are printing a star followed by a tab, a star followed by a tab, a star followed by a tab, a star followed by a tab. Even at this edge, this is an edge. So we are printing a star followed by a tab, star followed by a tab, star followed. Even at this edge, we are printing what? Star followed by a tab, star followed by a tab, star followed by a tab, star followed by a tab. Then even here, star followed by a tab. So the code will be exactly the same as the normal triangle, but with an exception that we have an if statement. So that if statement says if you are at the edge, you have to print a star and a tab. Otherwise, this means you are inside. Inside, we are only printing what? Tabs. So the idea is that if you're at the edge, you have to print the star followed by a tab. And if you're inside, you just have to print tabs. So how do we identify the edges? So notice that this is an edge and it's at where at k equals to 1. This is the first column at k equals to 1. Then this is also an edge. So it's at where it's at the last column. Last column k is equals to what? M. In general, k equals to m. Then another edge is here. Here is the row, so I is responsible for the rows. So I must be equals to 1. Then here you have the last row. So the last row I equals to n. So when we put this together, this is exactly the same code as the one for the normal rectangle. The difference is that you have an if statement here. But other than that, it's exactly the same. Nothing changes. For the outer loop, you start at 1, you end at m, then I plus plus. For the inner loop, you start at 1, you end at m. So, but inside the inner loop, you just put an if statement if you are at the edge. So this is an if statement for referring to if you are at the edge. I equals to 1 means you are at the first row. I equals to n, this means you are at the last row. K equals to 1, you are at the first column. K equals to m, you are at the last column. So if you are at the edge, you are going to print a star followed by a tab. Otherwise, you are going to print a what? A tab. Then you are just going to close the inner loop. Then new line. This is exactly the same code as the one we did previously. The only difference is that if you are at the edge, you print a star followed by a tab. Then if you are at the if you are inside, you just print a tab. So you can try to execute this code for n as an exercise. N equals to, let's say, 5. Then m equals to, let's say, 4. So I want to see the result for this. So you have to execute. So that one is an exercise. I won't go through it. It's easy to execute than to come up with a code. So another example, given and write a code that will print a hello right-angled triangle. So now we want to print a hello right-angled triangle. So again, the code will be the same as the normal right-angled triangle. The difference is that you have to identify what happens at the edges and what happens inside. So the solution, you have to identify the pattern again. So for n equals to 4, you are going to have these 4. So your I, we know that it goes this direction. This can be anything. It's not necessarily have to be I, k. You can have any variables. Then in this direction, we have our k, which always starts 1, 2, 3. One thing that we notice, the number of lines always depends on n. So the code is still the same. Like the code will be the same as the normal triangle. So in this case, we have to identify, the challenge is to identify if you're at the edges, what do you print? You print a star followed by a tab. So star followed by tab, star followed by tab, star followed by tab. But if you're inside, you're only printing tabs. So the difficult thing was to identify the edge, or the tricky thing was to identify the edges. So in this case, you have this as your edge, which is the first column. So k equals to 1. Then the other edge is this one, which is your last row. So here I equals to n. Then the difficult part, I guess, was the diagonal, or the tricky part was the diagonal. Notice here at this star, you have I is 1, k is 1. Here you have I is 2, k is what? It's 2. Here you have what? I is 3, k is 3. I is 4, k is 4. These give you the diagonal. So whenever I is equals to k, you have a diagonal. That's how you identify your diagonal. So now putting everything together, you just copy and paste the normal code we did for the triangle. It's going to be the same. But inside here, you are going to put an if statement. So if you are at the edge, how do you identify the edges? So k equals to 1, this means you are at the first column. I equals to n, you are at the last row. Then I equals to k, or k equals to I, this means you are at the diagonal. Again, for execution, you can execute this. You can just, as a challenge for n equals to 5. I want to see like the steps that you took for n equals to 5 as an exercise. Then here is an interesting exercise actually. So you have this: given n, write a code that prints the following triangle. So this is your homework. So for n equals to 4, n equals to 3, you are going to solve them the way I did with those ones. Then given n, write a code that will print a pattern. So here we have a hollow, sort of upside down right angled triangle. So even this one is an exercise for you guys. Then another exercise, executing, this is just for fun. So this is for fun actually, to execute this nested loop. So you can do this for fun. I'll just send the document and you'll do it from the document. Yeah, I think that's it for nested loops. So they are very tricky, but they are not that difficult. So for nested loop, this is the most challenging chapter, I think, nested loops. Other than that, everything is just straightforward. But nested loops are a little bit tricky. So you have to be careful when dealing with the loops or the nested loops problems. So yeah, for this session, we are going to end here.